The Campus Martius was a publicly owned area of ancient Rome about 2 square kilometers in extent. In the Middle Ages, it was the most populous area of Rome. The IV Rion of Rome, Campo Marzio, which covers a smaller section of the original area, bears the same name. Antiquity. According to Rome's foundation myth, prior to the founding of the city, Rhea Silvia, the mother of Romulus and Remus, threw her twin sons in the Tiber River, which would later run along the campus' western boundary, washing ashore further downriver. The brothers would return decades later to found a new city. Romulus, who became Rome's sole king, ruled for many years, until sometime in the 7th century. As he came to the end of his life, a storm cloud descended upon the center of the open field outside the city's pomerium in order to lift the elderly king to heaven. This land, between the city and the Tiber, became the property of Rome's last Etruscan king Tarquinius Superbus. After his defeat and exile, the plain was dedicated to the god Mars. Roman men assembled every spring, before heading off to fight hostile tribes surrounding Rome, and citizens gathered for important religious festivals. With the exception of a small altar to Mars near the center of the field, it wasn't until the 5th century BC that any visible changes were made to the field. In 435 BC, the Villa Publica was established in a prepared 300 meters clearing. The area was meant to be a gathering space for citizens to congregate every 5 years, to be counted in a census. Free from any permanent structures, no additions would be made for another 2 centuries. With the advent of the Punic Wars in the mid-3rd century BC, Roman military expansion moved out of the Italian peninsula, resulting in the reduction of seasonal musters on the field. The number of foreign wars, however, greatly increased the amount of wealth flowing into Rome. Generals who had sworn to various deities to build temples in their honor if victorious, used the vast amounts of wealth to fund these construction projects. Besides temples and wooden markets, entertainment venues were built also, though they were to be temporary. Starting in the time of Sulla, building lots were sold or granted to influential Romans, and insulian villas encroached on the common land. It later became the place for comitia centuriata, civic meetings with weapons, and for the city's militia. In 55 BC, Pompey constructed a permanent theatre made of stone, the first stone theatre in Rome, the Theatrum Pompeium. When the Curia Hostilia burnt down in 52 BC, the theatre was sometimes used as a meeting place for the Senate. The area was also used as the assembling ground for elections. Julius Caesar planned for the scepter to be placed there. They were later completed by his heir Augustus. In 33 BC, Octavian dedicated the Porticus Octavia, built from spoils of the Dalmatian War. During the Augustan period of the early Roman Empire, the area became officially part of the city. The Campus Martius also held the Aeropacis, built by the Senate to mark the establishment of peace by Augustus. It was intended to symbolize the successful completion of Augustus' efforts to stabilize the empire. Marcus Agrippa had the original swampy ground made into a pool and baths in a setting of parkland and temples, the Laconicum Sudatorium or Baths of Agrippa. Also, he built the Porticus Argonautorum and the Pantheon, which was later rebuilt by Hadrian as it still stands today. In 19 BC, he also completed the Aqua Virgo, to supply water to these new baths and fountains. In the non-populated northern area was the huge Mausoleum of Augustus. Other buildings that were made were the Theatre of Marcellus, the Temple for Isis, the Baths and Bridge by Nero, and Pompey's Theatre, where Julius Caesar was murdered by Marcus Brutus and his allies. After the Great Fire of 64 AD, Domitian rebuilt the burnt monuments plus a stadium and an Odeon. In 119 AD, reinforcing the themes of imperial divinity and apotheosis established by Augustus, Hadrian and the succeeding Antonines added a temple to Hadrian's mother-in-law, the divine Matidia, and a temple to the divine Hadrian himself built by Antoninus Pius. As was the case with the first two Flavian and Antonine emperors, the Severans didn't commit many resources to construction projects in an already crowded Campus Martius. Their interests lay elsewhere in repairs and commissioning new structures in other regions of the capital. The campus didn't see another major architectural change until the reign of Aurelian. The citizens of Rome took great pride in knowing that Rome required no fortifications because of the stability brought by the Pax Romana under the protection of the Roman army. In 270 AD, however, barbarian tribes flooded across the Germanic frontier and reached northern Italy as the Roman army struggled to stop them. To alleviate the city's vulnerability, the emperor ordered the construction of a 19-kilometer-long, 6 to 8-meter-high brick wall, fortified with defensive turrets, named the Aurelian Walls. Aurelian did not live to see his work completed under his successor Probus. In 276 AD, with the completion of the walls, the Campus Martius was finally incorporated into the rest of the city. By the mid-4th century, when Emperor Constantius II visited Rome, now the former capital, many of the pagan temples were closed. Buildings dedicated to Christianity began to occupy their spaces. Some were reduced to supporting material, some were razed, and some were given new roles, such as the Pantheon. In 663 AD, its bronze roof tiles were removed and replaced with lead, an act that Gregorius said was the result of excessive avarice and the excessive greed for gold. In the 5th century, Rome was burned and sacked twice. By the Visigoths in 410 AD, and by the Vandals in 455 AD. 3 earthquakes racked the city between 408 and 508 AD, and 2 floods washed over low-lying spaces in 398 and 411 AD. Many marble facings and columns were tossed into kilns to be burned into lime powder for reuse. Writing in the 12th or 13th century, Magister Gregorius marveled at those edifices in the field of Mars whose antiquity was clear but whose names were not as certain. Looking down from the heights of one of Rome's hills, he recorded that the great structures had been replaced by a forest of medieval towers. In 1581, French essayist Michel Montaigne traveled to Rome and noted that, upon the very wrecks of the ancient buildings, as they fall to ruin, the builders set out casually the foundations of new houses, as if these fragments were great masses of rock, firm and trustworthy. It is evident that many of the old streets lie more than 30 feet below the level of those now in existence. Geography. The Campus Martius was located not in the city proper, but north of the Capitoline Hill, just outside of Rome's Servian Wall in the early Republican years. Large, flat and, for much of the Republican period, grassy and unencumbered by man-made structures. The Campus Martius was a part of a floodplain framed by the Capitoline Hill to the south, the Tiber River to the west, the Pincian Hill and Quirinal Hill to the east, and a narrow throat of land between the Tiber and the Pincian Hill to the north. Until the imperial era, most of the region lay outside of the Pomerium. The field covered an area of about 250 hectares, or 600 acres, extending a little more than 2 kilometers north and south from the Capitoline to the Porta Flaminia, and a little less than 2 kilometers east and west in its widest part, between the Quirinal and the river. It was low, from 10 to 15 meters above the level of the sea in antiquity, now 13 to 20, and from 3 to 8 above that of the Tiber, and of course subject to frequent inundations. Ancient writers say that there were several recognizable natural points, such as an oak grove north of the Tiber Island and the Palace Capra, in the center of the space. Significance. In Latin, Campus Martius means field of Mars, a god highly considered in the Romans' pantheon. Paul W. Jacobs III attributes the significance of Mars to his patronage of both military and agriculture. In the calendar year, March was the month named after Mars. This month first marks the beginning of when the consuls started to work until 153 BC. The Campus Martius may have been named after the Ara Martis, which was talked about starting in the 8th century BCE. It is not known exactly when the Ara Martis was built, as well as when it was destroyed. The social climate and events around the Campus Martius were significant to Roman culture. Livy describes a horse race called the Quiria, which started on March 14. The winning horse was killed and sacrificed to Mars. The second event used to support his claim was the Anna Perenna. This event was when the plebs would go out to the Campus Martius to eat and drink. The reason why Anna Perenna was important was because she was an ugly hag and she represented the end of a year, and Mars represented the nice beginning of the year. The last event he talks about is the Tubilistrium festival, which purified military instruments to summon the cruciate assemblies. This celebration used to validate the king's imperium, but later on the festival validated the consul's imperium. By describing these events, Jacobs 3 does a good job of supporting the claim that the Campus Martius was culturally significant. Architecture. It is virtually impossible to pinpoint exactly when and why these stages occurred, but some historians have sectionalized different periods where Roman architecture faced relatively significant transformation. Regal Roman Early Republic. Between the mid-6th century BC and the end of the Early Republic, 4 temples were built. These were Temple of Diana, 6th century, Temple of Castor and Pollux, 495 BC, Temple of Apollo Socionus, 431 BC, and Temple of Juno Regina, 392 BC. Of these 4 structures, many view the Temple of Diana as semi-legendary since it lacks enough sustainable evidence to prove its existence. The reason these 2 periods are combined as one is because there is minimal certainty on the structure and style of these temples. The reason for this, out of probability, is because the material used at the time was neither concrete, stone or marble, materials that is sustainable longer term, and not only that but over 2 centuries there is certainly the risk of the destruction of these temples. Hellenistic age. After the death of Alexander the Great in 324 BC, or the beginning of the wave of Hellenism, there was a drastic increase in building construction within the city of Rome. In the case of Campus Martius, specifically during the wave of Hellenism, there were 7 temples built. These new temples constructed were as follows: Temple of Bellona, 296 BC, Temple of Fortuna, 293 BC, Temple of Juturna, 241 BC, Temple of Hercules, 221 BC, Temple of Vulcan, 214 BC, and Temple of Fortuna Equestris, 173 BC. The one temple excluded on that prior list is a temple built between 190 BC and 179 BC. It is uncertain if this temple was, as Cicero writes, the Temple of Nymphs, or as other sources believe, the Temple of the Larges Permarini. This period of Hellenism was the first major step in which the Roman temples, as well as the temples found in Campus Martius, were generally made of stone architecture. This new style was in a way a step from the simpler early forms, which often appear coarse and bulky in comparison to the aesthetic perfection and refinement of the later structures. This period was the transformation from simple experimentation to the strict mathematical complexity of ground plans and superstructures. The Hellenistic period was not only an expansion in terms of temples numerically within the Campus Martius, but also a stylistic transformation. Late Republic and Early Empire. Similar to the Hellenistic period, the Late Republic and Early Empire was also a period of several construction projects within the Campus Martius. This period, chronologically, began at the end of the Third and Final Punic War and lasted until the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in 65 AD. During this period there were 6 temples built in Campus Martius. They were Temple of Jupiter Stator, 146 BC, Temple of Feronia, pre-100 BC, Temple of Neptunus, 97 BC, Temple of Isis and Seriphus, 43 BC, and the Temple of Mars Altair, 02 BC. The one temple excluded from this list is the Temple of Minerva Chalcidica. The reason for this exclusion is because it is unknown whether this temple was built by Pompey in 60 BC or built by Augustus in 29 BC. Certain sources support the belief that Dion Cassius attributes this temple to Augustus. Temple of Minerva, which was called Chalcidicum, unlike the structural and stylistic transformation from regal period to the Hellenistic period, the temples in the Campus Martius were rather consistent. The main reason that these two periods are separated is because the motivation or reasoning for building these temples changed. In the past, these temples were more commonly than not an attribute to certain individuals for their past success by fellow patrons. But following the end of the Hellenistic period, these temples became more of political instruments than ever before. Instead of being merely genuine and slightly political donations that exemplified the successful of individuals, these temples in Campus Martius now were expected to trigger propaganda values whenever large architectural projects took place. Roman Empire alongside Rome. Temples built within the Campus Martius faced a fundamental change in stylistic direction during the latter half of the 1st century on. This was a period when the sculptures and linear forms of the classical past was first firmly challenged by the canopied volume of the future. This was a historical period for Roman architecture in that the catalyst for architects to embrace concrete as a design material, or as Nero describes it, break free from the shackles of the classical past. For possibly the first time, Campus Martius and all of Rome faced a period where they moved away from the classical ways of architecture.